Welcome to a new edition of the Neon Jazz Interview Series with veteran jazz vibraphonist Jay Hoggard. He was born in Washington, D.C. and grew up in Mount Vernon, New York. At the age of 15, he began playing the vibraphone after he had a dream about it. His latest album is in a long string of quality jazz LPs, and it's 2016's Harlem Hieroglyphs, and it's a great listen. His journey into music really took off when he majored at the renowned world music program at Wesleyan University, and for the last 20 years he's been a full professor of music at his alma mater. Over the years, he's toured Europe and the world, played Carnegie Hall, traveled to Tanzania, and well beyond with his music. He's collaborated with the masters, Lionel Hampton, Milt Jackson, Tito Puente, and the great Bobby Hutcherson, and he still has plenty to go in his jazz legacy. So please get to know Jay and dig this interview, my friends.
Thank you for taking some time out to speak with me. It's an honor to get to know you and to introduce you to the neon jazz world.
Well, Joe, it's my pleasure. Thank you for inviting me. I look forward to communicating with your listeners, and I know that you're completely about the music, so that's a great thing.
Right on. So I'm going to start off here and ask you, in your own words, give me a snapshot of activity that's going on in your world. My
latest album, which came out in the summer, is called Harlem Heiroglyphics, and it features myself on the vibraphone and Gary Bartz on the alto saxophone and James Weidman on piano and Belden Bullock on bass and Yoran Israel on drums and also Nat Adderley Jr. on piano and organ. I did quite a few things in the summer concerning that record, and then I teach at Wesleyan University in Connecticut, where I've been for 26 years, and I direct the jazz orchestra and teach theory and a few things. So between that during the semester and then performing with my ensemble, usually either quartet or quintet, although sometimes I add percussion and other instruments. But my core ensemble is a quartet with the Belden Bullock on bass and James Weidman on piano, and I've been using my good friend and colleague here at Wesleyan, Vernon on the drums, and Gary Bartz has made some of my performances, and then sometimes I use other saxophones. But Dwight Andrews, I was just down in Atlanta with my old friend Dwight Andrews, and that's kind of what I'm doing. I'm trying to intersect and cross all those kind of different musical worlds of the performance, of the recording and composing, and then the teaching college.
So before we go into your childhood with the Harlem Hieroglyphs, that's a power lineup. That had to be a fun album to make.
Yeah, I've known all of these music. Well, the core quartet, either Yoran Israel or Vernon on the drums, and those other two gentlemen have been the core rhythm section that I've been working with for more than 20 years now, more than 20 years, 22, 23 years. So we have a deep bond. And then on this record, Gary Bartz and I have been friends and colleagues for many years. This is the first time we had the opportunity to record together. And so I wrote the music. The music originally was from a dance theater collaboration for which I wrote the music. And so some of the tempos and some of the musical grooves and musical portraits were related to the dance project that I did with my colleagues here at Wesleyan, Nicole Stanton, who's a choreographer, and Lois Brown, who is a writer. And that was a big inspiration. We did a big performance here, and it's something that maybe will have a life separate from what we did here at Wesleyan, and but certainly the music has had its own life, and so I did a lot of performances with that, without the dance and without the dialogue and so forth. And that I try to think that way at this point in terms of composition. I'm thinking about context and painting, and from the Ellington template of doing tonal portraits. And so, yes, I'm trying to think thematically as well as conceptually in my compositions, and my sequences are that of a full performance that could be at any point, could be those other mediums could be inserted.
Right on. So let me ask you this. Tell me how a kid that was born in Washington, D.C., raised in Mount Vernon, New York, grows up to become so big in the world of jazz. How did this happen?
The music was organically part of I grew up in the church, in the African Methodist Episcopal Zion Church. So music, and both of my parents were very musically inclined. My mother was from Pittsburgh, and so she went to high school with Errol Garner, and my father was a minister, and he retired as a bishop in the church, but he was also a very gifted musician and organist and pianist, and so I had and he took me to see Duke Ellington's, my brother and me, to see Duke Ellington's the premiere of the second sacred concert in 1965 at our church in Harlem, and in fact, that church is one of the images in the collage on the album cover of Harlem Heiroglyphics, and it was in that sanctuary that I first saw Duke Ellington's full ensemble, along with choirs and then soloists and tap dancers, and I was 11 or 12 then, and that had a big impact, pretty much lifelong impact, on me being motivated to being in music and following the music path and trying to manifest in sonic consciousness in both music that is positive, spiritual, happy, and uplifting, and of cultural and personal significance. That's what I've been kind of really geared toward. And the music called jazz is a music that very much incorporates all of the artists, one way or another, incorporate those more lofty ideals. We don't normally just function on the level of trying to be the most popular of the minute or the most commercial of the minute. I think although there are many musicians and artists and composers who are in the more popular styles that also have the same kind of priorities. So I'm not about being a jazz snot or jazz snob. I'm just saying that style of music has been the kind that has drawn me the most, has the most ability to accommodate how I hear things.
So at 15, you have a dream that you're playing the vibraphone. You rent a set. How did this come about? Why did you dream about it? Why was this destiny picked for you?
I don't know. I mean, if I knew that, then I'd be, I could probably have a psychic TV show or something. I could, But yes, I did have a dream when I was 15 that I was playing the vibraphone, and I got up the next day and asked my father. I knew there was a place where we could rent a set, and in fact, my dad later bought that set for me, but first when we rented it, it was $10 a month in 1970, and that was, a significant financial, expense or significant commitment. But I, as soon as the first time I played it, knew that, this is what I'm going to be connected to, and it connected me to my studies of African marimbas and mallet instruments around the world and other percussion instruments around the world. And then when I went to college, I teach at the college that I went to as a student, as an undergrad, and we have a world music program, or world music is one of the concepts that we have of how we approach the study of music. And there were many opportunities to be connected to percussion musics, and through that I was able to connect to the tuning of the vibraphone is tuned the same way a piano is tuned, but also to hear other rhythmic and melodic possibilities in other traditions. and pretty much my whole career, the last 40 years, has been built around that.
So, in the beginnings, what albums were you listening to that really kind of got your jazz gears moving?
Well, I liked, like I said, the Duke Ellington. When my dad said he was going to take us to see Duke Ellington, I was 11 or 12, as I said, and I was like, who is that? I mean, I vaguely had heard the name of some old guy, and that didn't really interest me. And then when I got there and saw it, it was transforming. And by the time that was when I was 12. By the time I was 15, when I had that dream, I started listening to jazz. And as I said, my mother used to talk about that she went to high school with Errol Garner, and she could play songs that I didn't understand till I was grown and a professional, that she was playing in the same kind of style as Errol Garner. And so that, and then I used to see Lionel Hampton on television, and it never really connected until I started playing the vibraphone that, oh, this is the same instrument that he plays. And I also became really interested in Milt Jackson and the Modern Jazz Quartet. I don't remember which I knew first. Did I know the MJQ before I knew Milt Jackson, or vice versa? I can't tell you that, but I did go sometime after I started playing. They played at Carnegie Hall, and we had the opportunity to go see them. And again, that was a transforming experience, somewhere in 1971 or 72, somewhere in that zone. So Milt Jackson, and then Bobby Hutcherson, Roy Ayers, Cal Tjader. I grew up near the Bronx, so I very much had a Bronx kind of inspiration, which were what in terms of Latin music, African Cuban music, particularly artists like Mongo Santa Maria and Ray Barretto, and a group called Pucho and his Latin Soul Brothers, and Joe Cuba, both of which and all of which had some connection, and of course Tito Puente, all who had connections to the vibraphone, and one way or another, the vibraphone was a part of their musical palette. And so all those things, once I was drawn to the vibraphone, I was mostly drawn to that. I listened to John Coltrane and Miles Davis and many others, Sonny Stitt, Freddie Hubbard, McCoy Tyner, but my early influences were mostly those vibraphonists.
So was it always going to be music for you when you realized that the vibes were your instrument at 15, or did you have other dreams of what was going to happen for your life?
Well, I wanted to play in the NBA, but at 5'7", I was, I guess in high school I was about 5'5", so I didn't have these guys now that have these vertical leaps there's a guy that plays on one of the teams, on one of them, I can't remember, who's 5'6", who can jump, who can dunk. I never had that physical ability, so that was never going to be the case. And I played baseball, but I wasn't going to play for the Yankees, and I was too small to play football. So at one point, I kind of mostly got motivated by music because it seemed to have a lot of fulfillment. I always enjoyed writing. I said the other day that I was interested in writing for Mad Magazine, but that never that never happened. But I always have kind of a Mad Magazine kind of sense of humor.
Right on. So let me ask you this: your first go around with Wesleyan University in the World Music Program, you play in Europe and at Carnegie Hall during your freshman year. Your junior year, you go to Tanzania and East Africa. What was that educational experience like for you? What did you learn about music and being alive?
Well, yeah, that's kind of what I was saying. The World Music Program I performed with a fellow who was teaching here at Wesleyan, whose name was Clifford Thornton, who passed, but he was a trumpet player, and I went to Europe with him when I was a freshman in college, and we played at Carnegie Hall and played the Lofts in New York, Rashid Ali's place, Ali's Alley, and Sam Rivers' place, who also was one of my early teachers here at Wesleyan. His place was called Studio Rivby in the Loft era. So I had, those playing experiences, and then it was my second year after my second year that I, applied to this program where you could travel. So I went to East Africa, and I had been fortunate to travel a few places earlier in my life, but that was the first time I went so far by myself, and I was with a group of students, but we were not directly affiliated with a university. So anyway, I got to really experience that this is a big planet Earth. This planet Earth is big, and there are a lot of people on it, and we are not limited to seeing things just how we see them on our block or in our neighborhood or in our city or in our state. And it's a big picture, and music is one of the great common links of people who have different language and different experience, but music cuts through all that stuff. And so that was one of the big things that I learned early on, and was very fortunate and blessed to have been exposed to directly, and then I've tried to bring that into my work through all these years.
So you graduate in 76 from Wesleyan. You go to New York City in 77. That had to be just full of action in New York at that point. What was those early years like for you?
Thanks for asking. That's what I said. Those lofts, I went to New York. I taught high school for a year and then moved to New York just in order to make gigs. And there was in the area that's now called Soho, which is a very upscale area of Manhattan now, that used to be literally abandoned factory buildings and looked like it was kind of a bombed out neighborhood. And in that neighborhood was where many of the artists of the 60s who kind of came to maturity in the 60s had lofts. And so this whole business, there's a lot of people who are interested in the loft scene now. There was, and Ornette Coleman had a place, as I said, Sam Rivers, Rashid Ali, and Warren Smith had a place. His was a little further up. But there were a number of lofts and where musicians controlled the interaction with the music, and so it was not much of a business model. And usually playing in those places, you didn't play in them because you were trying to make money. You played them because you could go express whatever kind of creativity you had. And then at the same time, the 70s, late 70s was a disco era, and I was always interested in, because I grew up in New York, I was interested in being a studio musician also, to play on jingles and play on commercials and play on recording. So I did, and I had friends who were in pop and rock and roll and soul and the disco era. So I played on a few, no major hits, but I played on a number of recordings that were released during that time period of that kind of music. So I kind of covered a wide range between the so-called avant-garde in the loft scene and then the commercial studio musician scene, and in between trying to learn how to play the more traditional jazz in terms of the harmonic structures associated with the innovations of the 40s and 50s of people like Thelonious Monk and Charlie Parker and Dizzy Gillespie and Coltrane and others. So I tried. That was mostly my spectrum. I didn't do too many straight orchestral gigs, symphonic orchestral gigs, and I didn't really do any Broadway shows. I wasn't that I did one, but I wasn't really interested in that at that time. And full circle, this is where I'm kind of interested in writing some shows for Broadway or for that type circumstance, but using being based in jazz music as opposed to being based in what is more right now the standard palette of Broadway musicals.
Let me ask you this. The one thing that's interesting is that you've had so many collaborations over the years. You've collaborated with the masters like Lionel Hampton, Milt Jackson, Bobby Hutcherson. What do you learn from your collaborations with these musicians? How have you grown from those experiences?
Well, especially those guys were all vibraphonists, and I was very, very blessed to have had a relationship, kind of a student-teacher, mentor relationship with them. They were the mentors and the teachers, and I was the student, and I tried to be respectful of that relationship, and always felt when I was around them I was under the master's feet, so to speak. So we talked about not only things of technical issues of the vibraphone, but also just about music in general, and many kinds of points of view of life as a musician. Also, Kenny Burrell, I had the opportunity to play with his band for several years, and he was a very big influence on me. And as I said, Tito, Puente. But most of the longer relationships I had with those who I considered more the mentor teacher kind of role were those with other vibraphonists. And when I first came to New York, I played with the people who I considered my peers and my good friends, but they were more mature as band leaders than I was, such as James Newton, Anthony Davis, Chico Freeman, as I said, Dwight Andrews, and a number of other people, a trumpet player named Ahmed Abdullah, who's in charge of a venue where I'm playing in Brooklyn in December, Sister's Place, and many others. But those were some of the, a bassist named Vishnu Wood, who used to play with Randy Weston. And so I had a lot of opportunities to have kind of that longer extended apprentice relationship with both my contemporaries and then those who were one or two generations ahead of me.
Let me ask you this about jazz. You've been around for a long, long time, over 40 years as a performer. What kind of changes from the beginnings of you getting into jazz to today have you seen? Is jazz healthier? What kind of organism are we dealing with jazz these days?
Well, the music is very alive and thriving. It's tough because everything has shifted. I mean, when I got out of college and first moved to New York, we still were focused on records. I mean, literally LPs, long playing records, vinyl. And so one thing that I do in my classes, and I did this semester, I make the 18-year-olds go to the music library and only take out records to listen to. Don't tell me that you listen to something that you got it online or even from a CD, but that you learned about it from records, because there's still a lot of records in our library. And often they come back and say, wow, that was the first time I ever held a record, and it was like totally cool because I never did that before. And I said, well, that was the whole 20th century, how sonic information was transmitted. So and the reason I say that is that in the digital streaming era, there's a whole bunch of information that you can acquire right at your fingertips. I call the cell phones wisdom boxes. It's like, because I try to imagine if someone was from the 15th century, if they saw someone holding this box that can make all these sounds and they push a button and it does stuff, or it, has images in it, how, that would kind of freak someone out who didn't even know what electricity was, right? But the idea being that the younger people take that as a given. They don't know. Someone who's under 18 does not know the world before cell phones or before PCs, personal computers. Well, the point is, this kind of music developed, before that, and it didn't. Who's playing, right in front of you in 2016. There's a whole long history of tradition that informs what they do and how they got there, and in one sense, the cell phone type, the digital consciousness kind of cuts that out, because the digital consciousness, you push the button and everything is right there. So there's way more information, but oftentimes there's no context. So someone can play something from 1926 or 2015. All you do is hit the button and it still comes out. So it's pretty much, it's the same thing. Well, no, there's 100 years in between or 90 years in between that informed all that. So that's on the one level. Then on another level, there's so many gifted and talented young musicians who've come through school programs, and some of whom I've trained, and others who've gone through very strong programs in the many schools of music that teach this kind of music. They're very well prepared, and there are even less gigs because how many social events do you go to where they play recorded music? Because it's just way easier and way cheaper than having a band. Whereas when this music gestated in the early 20th century, the first half of the 20th century, the recordings were not something that you could bring to a social event. So there would always be musicians there. And that's one of the big differences, that music, it's only certain special events now where you go to a concert as opposed to something where it's alive and around everybody all the time. So that's kind of a difference. And I was at the end of that older era and the beginning of this newer era.
Yeah, absolutely. The one thing that's interesting, too, is that your life has kind of gone full circle. You were a student at Wesleyan, and now you're a professor. You've been there for several decades. What is it like to be, what is your philosophy? Based on being a student there and then now being a professor, what did you want to do with your experience with the students?
Well, I just try to be as honest as I can about the music, and also being clear that the music did not develop in what I call the studio that I teach in. It didn't develop in a laboratory like that. This music developed in society, in American society, in the complexities of the African American experience and the European American experience and the African diaspora and all of the above. When you hear Louis Armstrong, or when you hear King Oliver, or when you hear Fletcher Henderson or Duke Ellington or whomever, Tricky Sam Nanton or Bubba Miley in the 1920s, or Charlie Parker or Coltrane or Lionel Hampton or Tito Puente or Max Roach or Milt Jackson or any of these people, you're hearing an awful lot of information that they acquired and then they are embodying as transcendent artists. So we have to look at each of those when we hear their recordings, we have to think of them as great oral traditions who are speaking epic poetry and speaking, elucidating high consciousness through their sound. So that's what I try to inspire in all my students, to look at the music, not just I like it or I don't like it, or I like the way they bang on that in that part, or it made my feet move. Well, all that stuff is good, but I also want to look at the multiple layers beyond that.
You've had the chance to play with legends, you've seen legends perform, but let me ask you this: if you could go back in time and witness a jazz artist live, who would you go see and where would you go see him?
A jazz artist, okay. Well, I never got a chance to see John Coltrane, and I would have liked to have been at some of the many live recordings he did. Yeah, that would have been nice. That I know those recordings to actually see what the environment was like when they made them. Eric Dolphy, a lot of people. I was very fortunate, though, that I grew up in the era where most of the people that were the big inspirations for me, I did have a chance to connect with. I never saw Fletcher Henderson. I never saw King Oliver, for instance, and then there are others. But in general, I was very blessed, as you said before, to have a personal relationship with many of my musical mentors and role models.
So as somebody that's dedicated their lives to music, you've made such good music, you're an educator, you clearly love jazz, but in your own words, why do you love jazz?
Why do I love jazz? Because it's positive, spiritual, uplifting music of the highest order.
What's one of the nicest things a fan has ever said to you about your music?
Well, when people say that it moved them in some kind of way or another, I always feel gratified. I've been around the track long enough now that people will tell me they've been listening to me for a long time, and they'll say, Mr. Hoggard, and then I have to turn around because I think they're talking to, my dad or somebody else, and I've been listening to you for X amount of time, and I literally, I say, oh yeah, well, thanks, but I ain't dead yet, or I remember one time I told Milt Jackson when I first, maybe the second time I met Milt Jackson, I said, I listen to Bags and Train every day, the recording Bags and Train. I used to listen to it every day. And he looked at me like, Bags and Train, what is, oh, that's that record I made with Coltrane? You mean that, this was around late 70s, maybe 79. So he literally had to think about, oh yeah, I made that record 20 years ago. I vaguely remember that. And I thought that was the oddest thing because like I said, I knew every note on it backwards and forwards then. And now I've been around the track long enough to, people will come up to me and say, oh, I bought such and such a record, or I saw you performing in 1980 in such and such place, and I have to think about it. Oh yeah, okay, I was there. I'm still alive though. So.
Well, it's funny you've mentioned this several times. I know you're far from being done. You've been around the track quite a bit, but when you sit back in the easy chair, close your eyes and think about this great life you've lived in jazz, what do you want the kids of the future that peel back the pages of jazz to know about you? How do you want to be remembered for your contributions?
Well, like Ellington said, when he didn't get the Pulitzer or I think it was a Pulitzer, and he was like 72, and he said, well, it wasn't meant for him to get it yet because he's still too young. He had too many other things he had to do first before he could be judged. That's how I feel. I feel like, I've been very blessed to have documented my work. I want to keep composing and performing. Most of my writing my composing is tied with the vibraphone or with different settings with the vibraphone, but I'm now in a phase where I want to write more for large ensembles and write for settings such as for dance and for theater. So I wouldn't mind writing something like West Side Story or something like that and say, oh yeah, I wrote that. I haven't done that yet, and so that is one of the ambitions. But the point being that the sound of the vibraphone, if my compositions are associated with the vibraphone, I'm very cool with that. Because I say all the time, Bobby Hutcherson just recently passed, and Bobby Hutcherson is not only it's a given that he was a great innovator on the vibraphone, but he's also a great composer and conceptualist in areas wider than just with that instrument. In the same manner that some of the pianists are, great affect other than just on the instrument, or people on other, trumpet or whatever, trombone. So I would like to have some affect on other than just my instrument, but I can live with that. I'm totally cool with if people, associate me with the vibraphone, and not only am I cool with it, it's a blessing and an honor because I was to go full circle when you said about that dream, I was very blessed to have been given the opportunity to follow through in a relationship with that instrument. When I was 15, I wouldn't have expected I did a few of the things that I've done, and just because by banging on that thing, people still come up and say, "Oh yeah, I really like the way you bang on that thing." And do you have to practice? Is it something that requires any work, or people say, "What do you play?" I say, "The vibraphone." Vibraphone, what's that? Well, do you know who Lionel Hampton is? No, who is that? Well, do you know what a xylophone is? Oh, you mean that thing with the colors on it? Yeah, I had one of those when I was a kid. You're a professional and play that? So I'm cool with the idea of more people knowing what a vibraphone is. Everyone knows what a guitar is, more or less. Most people know what a trumpet is. Most people know what drums are. But once you get to, and what about the vibraphone? What the heck is that? So if my name is associated with that, I'm honored. Gary Burton, the great Gary Burton, was also a very big influence on me from the beginning, and many others.
Beautiful. Jay, I think that's a great way to wrap everything up. I appreciate you giving me some of your time today, and most certainly for all the music. It's beautiful.
Oh, well, Joe, it's my honor. I appreciate your insight too. You didn't ask me the usual run-of-the-mill questions, so I much appreciate it.
Thanks for listening and tuning in to yet another Neon Jazz interview, where we give you a bit of insight into the finest players in New York, Kansas City, and spots all over the world, giving fans all that jazz. And thanks to Jay for his time and all of that music. If you want to hear more interviews, go to Famous Interviews with Joe Domino on the iTunes Store, or visit the Neon Jazz YouTube channel. And for everything Neon Jazz, go to the neonjazz.blogspot.com. Until next time, enjoy the jazz, my friends.
Neon Jazz.